Hey guys, welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well, and welcome to this month's video. Today, we're going to talk about quick checkmates and opening traps. I'm sure you can remember a game you played that ended super fast, maybe in 10 moves or less. Obviously, it doesn't feel great to take a very quick loss like that. So the goal of this lesson is to teach you a few common checkmates and tricks that an opponent might try to pull on you, so you can easily avoid them, or use them against someone else. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Alright, starting off we have the 2-move checkmate. Now this one is pretty uncommon because the player with the white pieces has to make some questionable decisions for this to work. But basically, black can checkmate in 2 moves. So to pull this off playing black, your opponent playing white has to make some specific moves. Their first move must be either f3, f4, or g4, and I'll explain why each of those works in just a minute. But first, once your opponent makes those moves, you'll have to respond by playing e6. After that, your opponent has to move the other pawn they didn't move before. This means if they already played pawn to g4, they would now have to play pawn to f3, or pawn to f4. And if they already played pawn to f3 or pawn to f4, now they have to play g4. Now after that, queen to h4 is checkmate for black. Now the reason why this works is because the small diagonal from e1 to h4 is protected by only the pawns at the start of the game. By moving them up first, before developing a defense for their king, white created a weakness on the diagonal. So now you know what you can do to checkmate as black, but how can we prevent this as white? Well, in my opinion, the best option would be to just not move your f or g pawns during the start of the game. Instead, you should be moving your center pawns and minor pieces, which are the knights and bishops. Alright, moving on, we have the 4-move checkmate, also called the scholar's mate. Honestly, I'm fairly certain that even the best chess players from the past, like Mikhail Tal, and more recent chess players like Magnus Carlsen, have all been scholars mated at some point in their early chess careers, because this is just so common. The reason for this is because if it fails, meaning your opponent figures out your plan and stops it, for most beginner and intermediate players, it doesn't matter because they can just move their pieces back a little bit and continue the game like nothing happened. But that's enough talking, here's how you do it. This opening usually begins with white playing pawn to e4. Pawn to e3 also works, but pawn e4 is just generally a better move, so that's what we're going to go with. Black is going to respond with pawn to e5, which is the most common response to white's move. Next, white plays bishop to c4. Now you could also technically play a queen to f3 here, but bringing your queen out this early typically isn't a good decision because your opponent can easily target it, and that's just going to spend the first few moves running around the board being attacked, which is kind of a waste of time and it's not really helpful to us, so we're not going to do that. We're going to move our bishop out to c4 first. Alright, so after bishop to c4, black has several options that still let us pull this checkmate off, but we're really just looking for black to not play knight to f6 because that ruins it for us. But if they don't play knight to f6, they might play knight to c6, the next best move, so we're going to roll with that. Okay, it's white's turn again, and white is going to play queen to f3. I want you to take a moment here, maybe 15 seconds or so, to figure out what the winning move will play next turn is, because that's going to help us figure out what black can and can't play if we want to checkmate next move. Okay, so good job to those who found it, but if you didn't, don't sweat it. The move is queen captures f7 checkmate, which works because the bishop is protecting the queen. So knowing this, black can play a bunch of different moves and this will still work. However, the main moves that black might play to foil our plans are queen to e7 and knight to f6. Knight to f6 is going to block our queen from capturing f7, so it blocks the checkmate. And queen to e7, while not blocking the checkmate, allows black to trade on the f7 square. So once queen takes, their queen is going to take back. So if we capture f7, we're not going to have checkmate. Now, I mentioned this strategy is pretty common because it's not a big deal if it doesn't work. So before we move on, I'm going to show you why. So in this position, where black moves their knight up to block, here, we can actually just play, knight to c3 or pawn to d3 here. I'm going to go with knight to c3. Now, black has a ton of options here, but we're just going to say they play bishop to c5, which is what I would do. And now, it's been 4 moves for each player, and let's take a look at the position here. Both sides have developed 3 pieces each, and have some sort of center control. Now if I could choose, I'd still choose to play as black because white's queen on f3 is in an awkward spot, but for the most part, both sides are pretty equal right now, which means that even though our strategy didn't work, we're not getting punished for it, which makes this strategy something you can try out with minimal risk in your games. Okay, moving on to number 3, the Wayward Opening. This one is a high risk, high reward opening that you might see players use in extremely low time control games, and I'm talking really low time controls. I know for me, personally, I would only ever use this opening in bullet games where both sides only have 1 minute total to make all of their moves. And the reason for this is because if it fails, you are definitely worse off than your opponent. But even if you won't use it, this is still something you have to know so you don't fall victim to it if your opponent decides to play it. So this one's going to start with e4 from white and e5 from black, which seems pretty normal. But then white is going to go full throttle and play queen to h5. Now, take a brief moment to figure out what you would play here, because some moves that might look appealing are actually really bad for you. Okay, so before we go into it, when I played against this opening for the first time, I saw the queen get really close to my pawns, and I played pawn to g6. And this is actually the worst move you can play, so sorry to everyone who was thinking that. As black, you actually have 3 moves here. You can either play knight to c6, pawn to d6, or queen to e7. Basically, you just have to protect this e5 pawn and you'll be fine. But I didn't know this, and I played g6, thinking that I would get to push the queen back, get my pieces out, and have a strong attack. White then played queen takes e5 check, and the game was pretty much done. And now I actually made 2 mistakes here. 1, I didn't protect the crucial e5 square, and 2, I also let white fork my king and my rook. So the next turn, white just captured my rook, and I ended up down 6 points of material, if you remember from the last lesson, just 4 moves into the game. Another mistake you can make is playing knight to f6, which isn't as bad as pawn to g6, but white can play queen captures e5, and they get a free pawn here, so I just wouldn't play that. Now, the Wayward Opening has a lot of counters. Again, knight to c3, pawn to e6, or queen to e7 as black all shut it down pretty fast. But you have to be careful, because if you're not thinking about it, you can easily find yourself down a lot of material very fast as black. Okay, moving on to the last one, the fishing pole trap. This one's the most complicated, but bear with me because this one pops up a lot at the intermediate levels. Also, even if you don't understand every specific thing that happens here, just knowing the concept is valuable in itself, so let's get to it. We'll start with the Roy Lopez opening, which is fairly common, especially for players that are at the intermediate to advanced level. It's going to look like this. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, which is the Roy Lopez, and knight to f6. After we get here, white's gonna castle, and black will play knight to g4. Now, right now, this knight isn't doing anything, but in the future, it could be an issue for white with how far up it is on the board. So white's going to play pawn to h3, trying to kick it out. Now, most players would see the pawn attacking their knight and just move the knight back to f6. But with the fishing pole, we're actually going to push our h-pawn to h5. And this is where the trap starts, because white might not think about it, and they might just get greedy and capture the knight. Now if they do, we can capture back with our h-pawn. And take a look at the h-file. It's completely open, with our rook at one end, and white's king at the other. Now, white doesn't want to lose their knight, so they're going to move it back with knight to e1. But now notice, there's still a massive hole in white's king's defense. And now that the knight has left the f3 square, nothing is defending h4. So black can play queen to h4, which sets up a battery on the h-file that's ready to checkmate the white king. And now from here, white can try to stall a little bit, but as long as black doesn't mess up, black will checkmate from this position. And it's going to look something like this. White plays f3 to give the king an escape square, and then black plays g3 to cut off that escape square. White plays rook to f2, so that if we mess up as black and don't checkmate on the next move, the white king can just run away. But it's not going to get that opportunity because we have queen to h1, which is checkmate. Now, if you didn't catch all that, don't worry, because the fishing pole trap is by far the hardest thing in this video. However, I do want you to understand the important takeaway from the fishing pole, which is that you shouldn't create holes in your king's defense, especially when you have a rook staring down your king. Alright, that's going to be it for me. As always, the best way to make sure you remember something is to use it right away. But since everyone just learned about this, you might have a hard time catching someone with these traps. So what I would recommend is the next time you are playing against someone online, if you can, try out one of these openings or checkmates. And if someone tries to use them against you, as long as you can remember what to do, you'll be prepared to shut them down and win the game. That's it for me, and I'll see you in the next video.